Welcome to this explainer. You know, for decades, the true history of the blues has been wrapped up in all these wild myths, legends, and really fierce debates about authenticity. Today, we are uncovering the actual story of W.C. Handy, the man who very proudly wore the title Father of the Blues. But as we're going to see, that title is just the tip of the iceberg of a much deeper, incredibly complex story about art, commerce, and American history.
Okay, to give you a sense of just how intense these historical debates got, look no further than jazz legend Jelly Roll Morton. Back in a 1938 Downbeat magazine article, Morton was absolutely furious that Handy was claiming the famous Father of the Blues title. Morton shot right back, boldly stating that he had actually invented the blues himself in New Orleans in 1902. He basically accused Handy of just ripping off music he heard in the rural South and flipping it into a cash cow. It was definitely a huge clash of egos, but honestly, it brought up a really fundamental question about where this music actually came from.
And that brings us to the ultimate mystery we're decoding today. Did Handy actually invent this iconic American art form? Or was his true genius something else entirely? When we really dig into the history, the whole idea of a single inventor for a massive folk tradition kind of falls apart. But to truly grasp Handy's colossal impact, we first have to understand the world he was living in, and this one profound moment that quite literally changed his life forever. Section 1. The Tutwiler Station Epiphany. To find the truth, we need to rewind the clock and head deep into the rural Mississippi Delta, way before the blues was a global industry. What makes Handy's story so fascinating is his background. He was born in Alabama in 1873 to former slaves. His dad was a strict preacher who actually made a young Handy return his very first guitar and buy a dictionary instead. Can you imagine? Despite that, Handy chased music relentlessly. He became this sophisticated, classically trained band leader, fluent in reading and writing music, even playing the Chicago World's Fair in 1893. By 1903, he wasn't looking to discover the blues. He was just an ambitious working musician looking for paying gigs when he found himself stuck at a rural train depot in Tutwiler, Mississippi. While trying to catch some sleep on a hard wooden bench waiting for a delayed train, he was suddenly woken up. He heard a sound that he later described in his autobiography with this exact, unforgettable phrase, "the weirdest music I had ever heard." That single, unexpected moment on a train platform was about to fundamentally alter American music. Handy was watching an anonymous folk musician playing what we now recognize as Delta blues. The guy was sitting right there beside him, plunking a guitar and pressing a literal knife blade against the strings to get this haunting, sliding effect. He was singing about a local railroad crossing, just repeating the same plaintive line 3 times and bending notes in a way that completely defied standard Western musical rules. It was deeply emotional, incredibly raw, and totally improvised. This was the private, floating oral tradition of marginalized people in the South, and Handy instantly recognized its mesmerizing power. Section 2. Formalizing the folk sound. So if he didn't invent the blues out of thin air on that train platform, what exactly was his massive contribution? Well, he wasn't the inventor, he was the brilliant architect. Handy realized that this rough, native music could actually be organized. Rural songsters played entirely by feel, almost never playing a song the exact same way twice. But Handy used his strict classical background to take those floating anonymous sounds and lock them onto written paper so that any trained orchestra or parlor pianist anywhere could read and perform them. To pull this off, he basically had to crack a mathematical code. He needed to figure out how to notate the blue note, to teach formally trained musicians how to mimic that raw delta wail. Think about it. The singer in the train station was hitting microtones that physically fell between the keys of a standard piano. By deliberately instructing musicians to flatten the 3rd and 7th scale degrees in his sheet music, Handy captured the emotional tension of the blues in Western musical notation. He literally gave the world a written language for this feeling. Let's look at how he engineered this transition from a solo cry into a global industry. He absorbed that rural voice and guitar and then systematically packaged it. First, he standardized it all into a strict 12-bar structure, which is now the absolute gold standard for the genre. Then, he notated those crucial blue notes. Finally, he took what was meant for a lone voice and expanded it for massive rhythm sections, woodwinds, and horns. By making it reproducible, he made it highly commercial. Suddenly, any dance band across the country could just pick up the sheet music and play the blues. Section 3. Building a publishing empire. Formalizing this sound unleashed an absolute commercial juggernaut from Handy's home base on Beale Street in Memphis. But building that empire came with a really painful lesson first. Back in 1912, he published Memphis Blues, which is widely considered the first published blues sheet music. But strapped for cash, he sold the rights outright to a printer for a flat fee of just $50. Ouch. The song became a smash hit, and he didn't see a dime of those profits. But Handy learned fast. He partnered up with a brilliant businessman named Harry Pace, and together they formed their own publishing company. So when Handy wrote his 1914 masterpiece, St. Louis Blues, he owned the rights. That song exploded, earning him an unbelievable $25,000 a year in royalties and completely securing his financial empire.
And St. Louis Blues wasn't just a basic folk tune. It was absolute genius. It was a masterful synthesis of the raw Delta blues, ragtime syncopation, and even Latin rhythms he'd picked up during a trip to Cuba. He dropped what he called a Spanish tinge, a tango rhythm, right into the bridge of the song. And lyrically, he drew on profound empathy, inspired by a woman he once saw suffering on a dark street, which gave us the immortal lyric, "My man's got a heart like a rock cast in the sea." This hybrid mix made the track commercially irresistible. It smashed right through racial and geographical divides, turning a localized regional sound into a million-selling phenomenon. 100,000. That is the staggering number of copies that the hit song Down Home Blues sold in just 6 months. This was on Black Swan Records, a pioneering independent label founded by his former partner, Harry Pace, after they moved operations to New York. Handy and Pace were proving, without a shadow of a doubt, that there was a massive, incredibly lucrative market for Black music produced by Black artists and managed by Black executives. They weren't just making music, they were actively breaking down Jim Crow barriers in the music business.
Section 4. Competing historical narratives. Now, when you get that successful and wear a title like Father of the Blues, you're going to face fierce backlash from rivals like Jelly Roll Morton and later from purists. It's important we look neutrally at these two contrasting views that still shape how we see music history today. On one hand, you have the purist view, championed by folks like the legendary folklorist Alan Lomax. They argue that real blues is exclusively that raw, unpolished acoustic music born in the isolation of the Mississippi Delta. To them, Handy's big, structured orchestrations sounded way too much like commercial pop. But on the other side is the architect's reality. Without Handy's brilliant synthesis, his sheet music, and his push into vaudeville theaters, the blues might have remained a completely obscure localized sound. Handy's commercial engine is what actually taught the modern music industry what the blues was. Section 5. An enduring, complex legacy. So how should we actually view W.C. Handy's legacy today? Well, if we want to redefine Father of the Blues, we have to acknowledge that Handy himself never actually claimed he created the original folk music. He was an evangelist. He took a sound from plantation porches and marched it right onto segregated vaudeville stages, forcing the American music industry to respect it as a legitimate and highly profitable genre. By standardizing that 12-bar progression and writing down those blue notes, he quite literally drafted the blueprint for jazz, for swing, and eventually for rock and roll. Every rock, pop, or R&B track you blast in your car today owes a piece of its DNA to this exact synthesis. I want to leave you all with a final provocative thought to chew on. W.C. Handy took a sound born in deep hardship and isolation and gave it a structured voice so the entire world could sing along. But it begs the question, does standardizing and commodifying a marginalized folk art dilute its raw authenticity? Or is that commercialization the necessary spark required to elevate it into a global phenomenon that survives through the ages? It is a fascinating debate and one that lives on in literally every piece of modern music we listen to today. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer, and remember, keep listening closely to the music around you.